Today is February 11th, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine continues. Western analysts are exploring different ways to overcome the many and multiplying problems their Ukrainian proxies face on the battlefield, including ramping up the production of weapons and ammunition. I'll get into that in just a moment. Before I do that, I want to talk about what is taking place on the battlefield. I want to look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map. Please keep that in mind as we take a look. Despite it being a pro-Ukrainian map, you can see all along the line of contact, Russia maintains the initiative. They are on the attack. They are putting pressure all along the line of contact on Ukrainian forces, and much attention is focused on Avdiivka. And you can see the progress Russian forces are making. Again, even according to this pro-Ukrainian map, you can see this salient reaching into the city itself, risking cutting it off into two. This industrial area from the southern fortified city. This is the same process we saw unfold in Bakhmut, and before that, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and before that, Mariupol. And we continuously heard the same narrative. Ukraine is outfighting Russia. Russia is suffering astronomical, unsustainable losses, and yet Russia takes one city after the other, albeit after very protracted warfare. But as I've explained many times, this is Russia's strategy. This is a war of attrition. And at this point, the Western media is coming to accept that reality. We have seen articles, I've gone over articles where the Western media admits, yes, this is a war of attrition and Ukraine is losing it decisively. Yet every once in a while, we still see articles like this. This is from Forbes. This is from David Axe, February 4th, 2024. The clock is ticking as Ukraine destroys more Russian vehicles faster. The Kremlin could run out of fighting vehicles in 6 months. And this is an astounding conclusion to draw. And you would think that if this was true, this would be reported all across the Western media, and yet it's only being reported by David Axe in Forbes. Let's see what he says, and let's see what his source is for this astounding claim. He says, on each of the 705 days since Russia widened its war on Ukraine, Russian forces on average have lost, destroyed, abandoned, or captured 19 tanks, fighting vehicles, howitzers, or other heavy weapons. So what is this source regarding this claim? Open source analyst Andrew Perpetua tallies vehicles, losses, and publishes a daily list. Now, I've looked at this daily list. I've seen Andrew before on Twitter, now X, and even as a source of pro-Ukrainian propaganda, I could not take him seriously. He was too over the top, too overtly biased to be taken seriously. But because Forbes is now citing him, I was interested in looking a little deeper into his methodology. He has these spreadsheets that he publishes almost daily. And he has, what he'll claim that it's a tank, it was Russian, it was destroyed, and then he'll have a link leading off to the evidence of this claim that he's tallying on his spreadsheet and entering into his database. And when you click on the link, it brings you to a pro-Ukrainian Telegram channel with a picture that would be impossible to verify, where it was taken, when it was taken, what we're even looking at, and who it belongs to. And what he does instead is he just takes the pro-Ukrainian channel's word for it, that is a Russian tank destroyed on this day at this time, and that's what he's entering into the database. Here's another example of the type of analysis that Andrew does. This is him on Twitter claiming that Russia is destroying a Ukrainian ambulance with first-person view kamikaze drone. Now, very clearly, that is the white Balkan Cruise Nazi symbol scrawled on Ukrainian combat vehicles to identify them as Ukrainian combat vehicles. We all know that ambulances universally are identified with a very prominent red cross. Everybody knows this. But Andrew either doesn't know this or he thinks his audience doesn't know this. And so this is the type of analysis that he does. Now, why? Why is Forbes citing someone like Andrew? Because Andrew is doing this open source intelligence where he is claiming to collect data which he claims depicts Russia decisively losing, suffering catastrophic losses, unsustainable losses. And this is what allows Forbes to claim that Russia will run out of vehicles in 6 months. Since I was looking into Andrew's so-called analysis, I decided to watch, he has a YouTube channel, watch one of his videos to see what his take was on the upcoming Ukrainian offensive before it was launched. So I look at a video, and the link will be in the video description. You could go watch the whole thing yourself and decide for yourself. This is March 2023, and this is what he says.
And I think Russia will be able to do these attacks until around June or July. And then June or July, I think Russia will run out of armored vehicles. So I think like BMPs, BMDs, BTRs, and tanks. So I think in June, Russia will be weakened through their own offensives. And I think after that, Ukraine will attack.
Forbes is citing Andrew's analysis, open source intelligence, to draw the conclusion that Russia will run out of tanks in 6 months. Andrew himself has used his analysis and his data points to draw the very obviously wrong conclusion that Russia would run out of tanks by June or July. Obviously, his data is wrong. It makes no sense. It's nowhere near reality, and it caused him to draw absurd conclusions. And now Forbes, despite seeing Andrew draw all of these absurd conclusions, they're still using his information, his so-called data. This is how Forbes concludes this article, by the way. Despite pro-Russian Republicans in the US Congress cutting off aid to Ukraine last fall, despite the best efforts of authoritarian Hungary to block European aid to Ukraine, despite Russia's bigger population and bigger economy compared to Ukraine's, despite everything, Ukrainian troops aren't just launching drones and firing from trenches. They're winning the war of attrition. But clearly they're not. Clearly they're not, because if they were, the battlefield would look entirely different than it does in actuality. And someone like Andrew Perpetua, if any of his data was accurate, would not have made such absurd conclusions concerning when Russia would run out of tanks. June and July last year, now 6 months from now. But this is where Western media is. Much of Western media is starting to move toward accepting reality that, yes, this is a war of attrition and Ukraine is decisively losing it. But we still have certain corners of the Western media, certain analysts, certain commentators holding out and insisting that, no, Ukraine is still winning. Russia is suffering catastrophic losses, unsustainable losses, and collapse is just around the corner. And before the Western media began moving toward accepting reality, a lot of them were turning to these so-called open source intelligence projects or people, and that's where they were drawing their information from. And a lot of these projects are opportunists who are just telling the pro-Ukrainian public what they want to hear, and they're profiting from that. Others are obviously connected to the Ukrainian government, Western governments, and this is a way of laundering war propaganda through apparently independent outlets that people might be more willing to trust than the mainstream Western media, which fewer and fewer people trust. Now I want to talk about somewhat more serious analysis and commentary from the West. I want to talk about this roundtable discussion from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It was titled Munitions Production Roundtable. It's featuring Douglas Bush, Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. And so he is directly involved in U.S. Army efforts to increase the production rate of U.S. weapons and ammunition, especially in order to catch up to Russia, to give Ukraine more weapons, more ammunition, because Russia is making so much more and Ukraine is being overwhelmed on the battlefield. I want to go over some of the things that Assistant Secretary Bush mentioned. And there were other experts involved as well. The link will be in the video description below. It's an hour long. You can watch the whole thing. It gives you a very good understanding of how Western military-industrial production is organized. He says the U.S. plans to reach 80,155 millimeter rounds per month by 2025. They also have the additional target of 100,000 rounds per month, but that will require additional congressional funding.
You know, this year is critical in terms of the actual ramp up happening. So, you know, we've doubled production from when we started the conflict, but we have a long way to go. And this year is absolutely critical. And it's a multifaceted problem. Mm-hmm. It's not just making the metal shell itself. Mm-hmm. That production ramp requires also bringing on more, it's called load assemble pack. It's filling the shells with explosives, that function. We have to bring in dramatically more capacity for that. Right now, we do it at one place in one building. We're going to bring on 2 entire new facilities to do that, to supplement that building. We currently make artillery shells really in just 2 buildings, and they're about 10 miles apart. We're going to bring on 2 major new sources for artillery shells themselves. We're going to bring on for the charges that actually shoot the shell out of the cannon. So if you've seen movies or videos of, like, you know, battleships with those big charges that go in, smaller versions of those have to have those as well. So we're going to also add 3 or 4 new locations where those will be made, and we're making more new types. And then last, not least, if you look at the very front of the shell, the fuses, that's actually where we were the healthiest. We had excess capacity, actually, and it was in the private sector that we are now just maximizing. That was kind of just luck, but it was an important part of it. So the whole shell from the back to the front is part of that ramp up. So we are on a path to get to around 80,000 a month with the funding we have. We do need Congress in the supplemental to provide additional funding to get us to that 100,000 a month target you see at the top end of the range. We also need Congress to not just provide funding for capacity building, but to actually use the capacity to buy the shells. If you do the math on 155, if you're at the top end of that curve, it's about $3.5 billion a year to buy the shells. That's after you've built the capacity. So that's a significant funding lift, and we will need Congress's support. But I think we've made a good case, and I'm optimistic that we will eventually get those resources.
As they're increasing production, they are required to build additional buildings, additional facilities. So that is what a lot of the money is going into. He does not make it very clear whether or not 80,000 to 100,000 rounds represents all of these facilities maxing out production, or if that represents a certain rate of production that could be increased further if the money existed. He was not very clear on that. It seemed like they would be maxing out production, but I don't want to assume that. He talks about how certain components of these shells are not made in the United States. The explosives, for example, have to be sourced overseas, and there are many components or inputs that are sourced from supply chains that span around the globe.
You have to produce enough explosive, either IMX 104 or TNT, to fill that many shells that fast. And that production capacity does not exist in the United States by itself. So we're having to go overseas to allies. Luckily, we have many. They're highly capable in some cases. We're leveraging that.
Then he talks about how this was all possible. Many people look at U.S. artillery shell production and how quickly it has expanded. It has doubled. It has more than doubled. And people say, look, see, we can do that. We can expand production for all of these weapons and all of this ammunition. We're already doing it with artillery shells. But Assistant Secretary Bush made it very clear that no, that is not possible.
So the story actually starts before the war in Ukraine. Thanks in part to Congress, the Army, even before my arrival, started some critical early work on the need for renewed investments in the Army's own capacity, meaning our capacity in our government-owned factories that do a lot of the conventional munitions work. That started up. Congress actually started adding funding back in FY18, FY19. That led to us having a plan. As it turns out, it was very fortuitous that we had the plan on the shelf. So when Ukraine happened, we already had a plan we could execute to dramatically expand and modernize the Army's organic industrial base that helps produce most of our conventional munitions, such as artillery shells.
The only reason why the U.S. was able to do this in regards to artillery shells is because the U.S. Army owns the factory that is making them. And they were able to get money, put it aside for maintaining surge capacity, just in case in the future it would be required. And they did this years before Russia began its special military operation in February 2022. They prepared all of this years in advance. That's why the additional capacity exists. That's why they're able to expand so quickly. He specifically mentions that other munitions, Patriot missile interceptors, the guided rockets for HIMARS, Javelin anti-tank missiles, all of these are produced by private corporations who do not have surge capacity, who see surge capacity as economically inefficient and as a factor undermining their profits.
I think Dr. Ross's point about surge capacity, though, is terrific, because a more efficient way to do that is not to maintain massive peacetime stockpiles, but have the ability to, when needed, ramp up faster. That way you get the very latest version of it. For example, a precision weapon, you get the brand new best one, not a big stock of older ones. But the challenge is how to think through how to do that in a way that's because excess capacity is inherently economically inefficient. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't plan for it in some cases. Doing that for everything and doing that in the private sector with precision weapons is a different kind of challenge, because those are private companies that have don't always have the kind of flexibility to use capital the way we do. But that's a conversation we have to have because especially a conflict with, for example, China would require more of the precision weapons and maybe not as much artillery, and that ramp up would be more important.
And if you listen to this entire roundtable discussion, these experts talk about different ways they might actually be able to get or convince private corporations to maintain some sort of surge capacity for the future. But none of it is convincing. They talk about using technology like robots and 3D printing to give America an edge in munitions production. The problem is this is not 1950. This is not even the 1980s. The rest of the world is catching up with the United States technologically. Some parts of the world are even surpassing the United States technologically. Russia and China already clearly have. They have robots. They have 3D printing. They are incorporating it into their military industrial output. So any means of production the United States can come up with to make surge capacity cheaper or more affordable, Russia and China can do the same, but just on a much larger scale, because their entire economy and society is set up to prioritize the purpose of arms manufacturing versus the US, where arms manufacturing, the priority is to maximize profits. For Russia and China, the priority is national defense. Russia has set aside huge amounts of surge production, not just for artillery shells, not just for tanks and missiles, but also for all of their downstream suppliers. And this was something else Assistant Secretary Bush brought up while discussing all of this, the fact that even if you can convince an American corporation to include some sort of surge capacity in the future, again, this was all speculative. Nothing is even being seriously talked about in terms of getting corporations to do this. But he said, even if you could convince them to do this, you'd also have to ensure all of their downstream suppliers also had surge capacity. And the chances of any of this happening anytime soon is next to zero. Meanwhile, in Russia and also in China, surge capacity is built into the arms and munition factories and also their downstream suppliers. It's very, very important to understand these fundamentals of military industrial production and how it differs between the way the West does it and the way Russia and China do it. How the United States can have a larger population, a larger GDP, spending so much more on defense and yet be incapable of outproducing Russia in something like artillery shells. Beyond the military industrial base, you also have to keep in mind trained manpower to draw from, to send to these factories when they are expanded. I want to point out this Forbes article that I have referenced many times in the past. This was actually from 2016, this graph. It says the countries with the most STEM graduates. STEM means science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I usually use this chart to show people how many millions more graduates China produces every year versus the United States. Even though China has a larger population than the US, this is actually also a higher percentage of the Chinese population than the US. But another interesting fact is Russia has an almost comparable number of graduates as the US. US has more than twice the population of Russia, yet they have a comparable number of STEM graduates. And this illustrates the different priorities that American society has versus Chinese or Russian society. This is what allows Russia to outproduce the United States in terms of arms and munitions. They have a completely different set of priorities. They are purpose-driven. Their arms industry exists to provide for the needs of national defense. The United States arms industry exists to maximize profits for shareholders. That is why this disparity exists, and this is why it'll be very difficult, if not impossible, to close this disparity. Ultimately, the way the United States is organized versus the way Russia, China, and many other countries are organized in terms of society, politics, industry, education. The United States as a society, as a nation state, is organized around the premise that it is exceptional, that it holds primacy over the globe. It has created this international order that it leads, that it created, that benefits it first and foremost, above all others. And its foreign policy objective is to maintain this primacy over the globe. And yet, as you can see, the United States represents a small percentage of the global population. And now we see nations with industrial bases, education systems, infrastructure, military power surpassing the United States. Nations surpassing the US in different aspects. And of course, the collective world, the rest of the world outside the West, is by far surpassing the United States. We can just look at the G7 and its percentage of the global GDP, how that percentage has gone down over the years, and how the percentage of GDP among BRICS is actually higher now than the G7. The premise that the US is building all of its foreign policy on top of the idea of maintaining primacy around the globe is unrealistic. And everything built on top of it, no matter how smart people like Assistant Secretary Bush is, no matter how well he does his job, because the premise of what he's doing is built on top of is so fundamentally flawed, there is no way for him to succeed at his job. There's no way for the US to produce more shells than Russia or China, let alone Russia and China. So these are important things to keep in mind. And I just want to point out that I'm watching these discussions where they're admitting Russia is outproducing the United States. And when you go back to articles like this from Forbes, you realize how detached from reality, even more so than the policymakers, how much more detached from reality the Western media is becoming. And David asks, is drifting dangerously far from reality, and yet he continues publishing articles for Forbes. I could only assume that David X's articles get a lot of views, and so Forbes looks at that and they measure that as a metric of success. But in reality, what are you doing as a newspaper? What is your goal? Is it to maximize views, or is it to inform people? And if it's just to maximize views, and saying things that are ridiculous and detached from reality is how you maximize views, what are you doing to your audiences? What are you doing to the general public exposed to media like this? And if you think about all of this, how it all adds up together, you can see very clearly why the West is having all the problems that it is having in reality, despite all the advantages it's supposed to have on paper. I will continue keeping an eye on the conflict in Ukraine. I will also continue keeping an eye on developments in the military-industrial bases of the United States, of Europe, Russia, and China. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing to my channel. It's free to do and it helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. In the video description, I've also included all of the links that I've referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my channel, my YouTube channel. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not doing me any good. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others and helping get the word out there, I greatly appreciate that. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.